Every country on Earth keeps records. They count their people. They count their land. They count their dead. Because a government that counts its people cannot pretend those people do not exist, cannot take their land, cannot erase their history, cannot deny them what they are owed. Records are not just paper. Records are power. And in 1890, someone decided that certain people had too much of it. It was the end of a century. America was growing faster than any nation on Earth. Cities were rising. Railways were cutting through mountains. Factories were filling with workers from every corner of the world. And every 10 years, as the law required, the government sent workers out across the entire country, door to door, farm to farm, village to village, to count everyone. Every man, every woman, every child, every piece of land, every home, every business, every debt, every occupation, every year of residence. The census of 1890 was the most detailed count America had ever attempted. It counted communities that had never been counted before. Freed black families, who had spent 25 years building lives after slavery. Men and women who had once been owned as property, now owned land. Native American communities, who had survived the land wars of the previous decades, who were still here, still standing, still on their land. Chinese workers who had built the transcontinental railway with their bare hands, and stayed. Immigrant families from Ireland, Italy, Poland, Germany. People who had crossed oceans with nothing, and arrived with everything still ahead of them. For the first time in American history, these people had proof. Proof of where they lived. Proof of what they owned. Proof of how long they had been here. Proof that they existed. 2 years later, that proof was gone. The 1890 census was stored in one place. The basement of the Commerce Building, Washington, D.C. Hundreds of thousands of documents, millions of names, millions of addresses, millions of futures, written in ink on paper. In 1896, 6 years after the count was completed, a report was filed inside the census office. It noted water damage, mild deterioration from storage conditions. A recommendation was made: move the records to a safer location. The recommendation was noted and ignored. Then in January 1921, a fire broke out in the Commerce Building basement. By the time it was reported, by the time anyone arrived, a significant portion of the 1890 census was gone. The official report said the fire started from a spark, a heating pipe, an accident. But investigators who examined the damage noted something that did not fit. The destruction was not consistent with how fire moves. Fire spreads outward from a single point. It burns what is closest first. It leaves a pattern. The damage to the 1890 census records had no clear point of origin. The destruction was spread, targeted, thorough. And then Congress made a decision that historians still argue about today. Rather than preserve what remained, rather than protect the surviving documents, Congress ordered the rest of the 1890 census to be destroyed, pulped. What the fire had not taken, the government finished. The official reason given was storage space. The records were too damaged to be useful, too expensive to preserve. But other census records from the same era, equally old, equally fragile, equally damaged, were preserved without question. Records from 1880 survived. Records from 1870 survived. Records from 1860 survived. Only the 1890 census was destroyed. The one census that had counted everyone. When you destroy a census, you are not destroying paper. You are destroying people. For black families in the American South, the 1890 census was everything. After emancipation in 1865, hundreds of thousands of freed people had spent 25 years building, buying land, starting businesses, registering property. The 1890 census was the first official document that recorded their progress, their land, their names beside their property, their status as citizens with documented stakes in American soil. When that census disappeared, their documentation disappeared with it, and without documentation, land claims become disputes, disputes that courts ruled against them, because there was no record. In the decade that followed, black land ownership in the American South began a sharp and devastating decline. The census that had protected them was gone. Black families were not the only ones who lost everything. Native American communities across the country had been counted in 1890 for the first time. The ghost dance movement had swept through reservations that same year, a spiritual movement, a desperate prayer for the return of their land and their way of life. The government was watching, taking notes, counting faces, recording names. The 1890 census recorded which communities were growing, which leaders had influence, which reservations sat on land worth taking. When those records disappeared, so did the evidence of what had been there. Land documented as occupied could now be claimed as empty. Communities recorded as established could now be called nomadic, temporary, without permanent claim. The Chinese communities of California suffered a different kind of erasure. The Chinese Exclusion Act had been passed in 1882, 8 years before the 1890 census. Under that law, length of residence was the difference between the right to stay and deportation. The 1890 census had recorded tens of thousands of Chinese families, their addresses, their occupations, their years of continuous American residence. That census was their proof, their legal protection, their documented right to remain. When the census was destroyed, their proof was destroyed with it. And the immigrant communities, the Irish in Boston, the Italians in New York, the Polish in Chicago, the Germans in Milwaukee. For these families, the census was their path to citizenship, their proof of continuous legal residence, their evidence of belonging. Without it, they were strangers again. In a single act of destruction, millions of people lost their paper identity. And paper identity in 1890s America was the only identity that counted. America was not alone in this. While the 1890 census was being quietly destroyed in Washington, D.C., governments across the world were learning the same lesson. Control the record, control the people. In colonial India, the British Empire conducted detailed censuses of its own. Indian land holdings were recorded, then reclassified, then taxed into default. Families who had farmed the same land for generations suddenly owed taxes they could not pay. In colonial Africa, the German government documented the Herero and Nama people in careful detail. Their population, their cattle, their land, their leadership. Those same records were used a decade later to plan their near extermination. The census that counted them became the map that hunted them. The pattern was the same everywhere. Count the people, use the count. Then, when the count becomes inconvenient, lose it. A census worker in Virginia filed a formal written complaint in 1892. His name was never recorded in the documents that survived, but his complaint was. He wrote that records in his district had been altered after submission. Names had been removed. Property entries had been changed. His complaint was received, logged, and buried inside the same system he was complaining about. A journalist in Boston began investigating in 1893. She published 4 articles. Her editor refused to print her name for her protection. The articles named specific districts, specific alterations, specific officials who had no authority to make the changes they made. The series ran for 4 consecutive weeks. Within a month, copies of that newspaper began disappearing from public library shelves in 3 cities. Not checked out, removed. One copy survived, found in 1987, a private estate sale in rural Massachusetts, inside a wooden box of personal letters, belonging to a retired schoolteacher. She had kept it for 90 years. Nobody knows why she kept it. Nobody knows how she got it. Nobody knows her name. In the Native American communities, oral historians had anticipated this kind of erasure. For generations, knowledge had been stored not in paper, but in people, in ceremony, in song, in story told from elder to child, beside fires that burned through the night. The government could burn the census. It could not burn memory. Tribal historians began creating parallel records, church baptism books, trading post ledgers, private family documents written in native languages, land maps drawn by hand and passed from parent to child. Hidden, passed down, protected. It is because of those hidden records that some families today can still prove what their ancestors owned. Not because the government kept the truth, but because ordinary people refused to let it disappear. The 1890 census is the single largest gap in American historical records. Genealogists call it the black hole. Millions of Americans today are trying to trace their family histories and hit a wall at 1890. On one side of that wall, records from 1880 survive. On the other side, records from 1900 survive. But the decade in between, the decade when freed black families were at their peak, the decade when Native American land rights were most documented, the decade when immigrant communities were most completely recorded, that decade does not exist in the official record. Land disputes that should have been settled a century ago are still being argued in courts today. Descendants of families who owned property in 1890 cannot prove their inheritance, because the proof, the destruction of one census, cast a shadow across the next 100 years. History is not just what happened. History is what someone decided to write down, and what someone else decided to erase. The people who ordered the destruction are long dead. They left no confession, no admission, no, but they left something else. They left the gap. And gaps tell their own story. A government that destroys its own records is a government that knows exactly what those records prove. The year that was deleted did not disappear because it was unimportant. It disappeared because it was the most important year of all. The year that proved that millions of people the government preferred to forget were here. They were always here. And now, so is the truth.